I'm super happy that Alan agreed to be a presenter for our club. We actually just got to have his food recently up in Wisconsin when we were there for the Food as Medicine conference. And I'm happy to report that Alan's food lives up to all his descriptions and pictures. So um, I really appreciate that he's done lots and lots of in-depth research into foods of other cultures, not just food that people are familiar with in this country. I was impressed with a recent post he had about um, how dock leaves are eaten. Is it Armenia, Alan? Is that right?
Yes, it's called Avaluk.
Right. And it's kind of a leaf that anybody that's interested in wild edibles kind of overlooks. But he said it made a really delicious soup, so I'm looking forward to trying that recipe. So I really like Alan's adventurous palate, and I especially was thrilled with the book that you wrote, which
Thank
I
you.
know we had in our post that we sent out, and I know you're going to talk about some more. And also, I've enjoyed seeing you on TV too. So um, I basically am excited to see what you'll have to share with us and look forward to learning some new stuff. So thank you, Alan. So should we put it on? Do you want a spotlight, Alan, dear?
Yeah.
I don't know what that is.
Put
Okay. All
you
right.
in
I'll
front and
share my
center.
screen.
Oh, and we often ask people to turn off their video feed. It helps the bandwidth for this broadcast. So,
Okay,
um,
sure.
not you, Alan, though,
Okay. Now I'm back.
just the other people. So,
All right. Share my screen here.
great.
Okay. So what I have for you today is it is a basic how I cook with mushrooms, nuts and bolts walkthrough of kind of my preferences and some things that I do that may be similar to what you do. They might be very different from what you do. I can be a little bit opinionated, as chefs tend to be. So I'd encourage you to, take in the information, take in some of my opinions, take what you like, maybe leave what you don't if there's something that you're preferential to. But we'll kind of cover a few nuts and bolts things like harvesting, cleaning, just my preferences and specific ways that I've learned kind of over the years how I like to do things. And then I'll cover uh a few of my favorite edibles, a couple different experiments. So I know some of you will know me and maybe some of you don't. My name is Chef Alan Bergo. I was in the culinary industry as a professional chef for about 15 years. I still am in the culinary industry, kind of, but I don't have a restaurant anymore, and I probably won't again. Right now, I'm coming to you from the beautiful heart of the Hiawatha Forest in the Upper Peninsula, Michigan. I'm here as a guest chef for the week at my friend's bed and breakfast called the Milkweed Inn. She actually got a Michelin star. Her name's Liana Reagan. We've been having a great time going out in the woods like every day this week, planning for, I think she said, a 14-course tasting menu that we're going to do on Saturday. But I was in the restaurant industry, and after so many years, I had seen all kinds of things. I knew how to cook. I thought I knew how to cook just about everything. And then I got to a restaurant called Heartland where the menu changed every single day, and we only used products from within 200 miles of Minnesota. And I saw my first wild mushroom. And then I would taste the mushroom and put it on the menu that night for whatever I wanted to make. And I basically got spoon fed all of the different, the best species in my area while I was working on the job. And the same thing went for plants. And then inevitably I ran into some on my own and I got the mushroom bug, and I kind of never looked back. I started writing about mushrooms on my website, foragerchef.com, 10 years ago. Seems like a lifetime ago. Actually, the anniversary was last month in May. And I started that when I was still in restaurants, actually when I was living in my friend's basement and kind of needed something to do to pass the time. Wanted to share with people my love of mushrooms because there was no Facebook groups. This is before all of that. Then my restaurant closed, and I basically decided that I didn't want to go back, that my work-life balance is terrible, and I decided that hunting plants and mushrooms full-time as a career sounded like a much better way to spend my time. So I have my website. I'm the author of the Forager Chef's Book of Flora, the host of the show. Oh, what do we have to call it now so we don't get sued by PBS? Field Forest Feast is the name that we have to use. We used to call it the Wild Harvest. It won the James Beard Award last year and 2 Taste Awards. Was also on a show that's on Hulu called Chefs versus Wild, where I'm out in the wilderness harvesting food in the wilderness of British Columbia for kind of an Iron Chef competition at the end. But basically, I'm out here working with wild food. Mushrooms were my first love and are very close to my heart, but I'm out here working with wild food just about every single day, and it's what I do. I love it very much. Here's a couple things that we'll cover. Basic general cooking info. We're gonna go over bugs. I know that this can be different depending on where people live, and I get there's tons of bugs in the mushrooms up here, and it's something that, you know, you kind of get to learn how to work with, and I definitely have some advice for working around and working with them, but not cooking them. Entomophagy is a totally different thing. I am talking to a new producer about a show on roadkill. We'll see if we can work some insects into that. We'll see. I do not have high hopes for that. We'll talk about cleaning and storing. Like I said, just basic things in my opinions on them. Basic cooking methods, preservation methods, old ones, some new ones. One of my favorites, underused species. I think everyone should know specific uses for common species that a lot of people, at least up where I live, tend to find. We'll have a little time for Q&A. And one of my favorite underused species up here is the bullion bolete. And I still am debating with my friends over which one this is. It's Lanmo at something, if it's Carmenipes or another one, I don't know. But they're so good. I'll go over a few that I really like. So kind of a basic high up thing, like step back for a little bit and just talk about how we cook mushrooms. One of the best things about foraging is that we get to witness the great gluts of nature, and we can harvest, you know, at the right time, in the right place. We all know what can happen. You can run into a whole bunch of mushrooms and have more than you can know what to do with. So you get to cook with mushrooms in quantities that, you know, really only chefs get to cook with. And that's very special. But I'd like to invite you to think about cooking with mushrooms in general in 2 different ways, because this is basically how I cook them. And I'm taking a page from Chad Hyatt here. I was talking to him last year when he was in Wisconsin, and we had a great talk while we were trying to pick black trumpets, not finding many black trumpets. So mushrooms can be in the foreground, or they can kind of be in the background. And there's 2 good examples here of that. So fried puffballs, which I do love, on the left-hand side. With that, the mushrooms are a center of the plate item. The dish is focused around the mushrooms. Okay? The second one is actually a really fun dish that I did for my friend's show on the Outdoor Channel called Wild Fed, where we were catching wild crayfish with our hands. And that is a gumbo made with milkweed pods and sausage and wild rice and wild crayfish broth. And you can also see there's some mushrooms in there. There's the little tiny chanterelle buttons in there, which are some of my favorites. In that kind of dish, mushrooms are going to be in the background in like a soup or a stew. So sometimes I've heard from people like, oh, you know, I added mushrooms to this soup and the whole soup doesn't taste like chanterelles. That's okay. If you want the more ingredients, generally speaking, the more ingredients that you put in something, the harder it may be to taste the individual mushroom flavor And that is not necessarily a bad thing. If we take lobster mushrooms, for example, have a very mild flavor fresh, that is a great way to use mushrooms that are mild is in things like curries, things that have a lot of flavor going on, big flavors where the mushrooms can maybe just become more of a textural element. So just something to think about there as we're going through this. Okay, bugs. So bugs are so fascinating to me because it's like everyone has a different personal preference. It just varies so much from person to person. And I have one friend, my closest friend that I hunt mushrooms with to this day. Anytime I cook a chanterelle or any mushroom, every single mushroom, he inspects the stem and turns them over and looks at me and he'll say, "You're not feeding me any bugs, are you, Bergo?" And every single mushroom is inspected. Then I have another friend who might be the president of a mycological society in one of the 2 states I frequent, and he will eat mushrooms on the doors of death, filled with bugs, wet morels crawling with larvae, and insist that they're excellent. It varies from person to person. But basically, the thing that I do when I take a mushroom, I cut the stem, and this will be similar for many of us, I would think, and I'm going to immediately look at that for bugs. And if I see a few holes, I will keep cutting up the stem until I don't see any bug holes. Because what's going to happen if you put mushrooms with bug holes into your fridge, the bugs will be slowed down by the cold temperature, but they will continue to move around and eat things, or maybe they get jostled and then they're all going to crawl out. One thing that's kind of fascinating is that we used to have an open air market at the restaurant, that Heartland that I mentioned before, and we would have commercial mushrooms sitting next to wild mushrooms. And the sous chef messed up one time and he bought a chicken of the woods that was so ancient that this thing could barely be called food. And of course, it was just crawling with larvae. And the next day, chef went into the market and he took a look, and all the oyster mushrooms seemed to be wilting. And then the chanterelles that we had, they were kind of looking discolored. And what we figured out is that they were transferring from the chicken of the woods to all the cultivated mushrooms. And sometimes we can see if a mushroom is going to have bugs in it. Chicken of the woods is a great example. And I don't know if this is a technical term, but I like sometimes when I see them and they're kind of stunted, I call it cauliflowering. And it seems like they wanted to make leaves and then they couldn't. It seems like they're way more prone to bugs that way. But if I see a mushroom that is covered in flies, I'm just going to skip it because it's generally going to look like the mushroom there on the left-hand side. And those, you can see that obviously the bugs, heating mushrooms is a kill step, and they would never hurt you. There's the whole joke about extra protein, ha ha ha, whatever. But what the bugs do is, the bad thing is that they will eventually compromise the structural integrity of the mushroom and decrease the shelf life. And that is kind of the big issue. And one of the overarching themes here of my talk that I have for you is sometimes foragers, like many of them, we can maybe treat things in a way that there is less than treating something like food and more like treating something like a prize. One example, and I'm not trying to call my grandmother out, but I have to a little bit, is grandma harvests puffballs. And she'll take the puffball and she'll just let it sit on the counter. And then the bugs are just going crazy in it. And we need to treat them like meat, because they're closer to meat than they are to plants. Okay, now the test, we're going to see how video works. So this is just a basic nuts and bolts of how I harvest most mushrooms. Now, people can get pretty fired up. It seems to be mostly about morels, about the cut versus pull. I'm not going to have a discussion about that at all. What I tell people to do is the best way to harvest a mushroom is the way that is the least destructive to the fruiting body that leaves you with the cleanest mushroom possible, whichever that way may be. So I cut the morels in this video, and many of them I do, but sometimes it can vary between species. With chanterelles, with our what is it? Our Cantharellus analensis here grows up with red pine, and it grows deep into the duff. So with those, I have to remove them from the ground because they may have 3-4 inch stems buried in the needles. So each species can be kind of different. And I just encourage you to just remember to treat them like food and put clean mushrooms in your basket. What I do, I take the mushrooms and I cut them, and I'm just making sure that they're clean when they go into the basket. And a little morel porn never hurt anyone, even though our season is past here. Also, I heard there was some talk about the burn morels maybe not being that good. I absolutely agree with that. The riverbank morels, Morchella americana. One thing I like to quote when people say burn morels are better or these are not as good is that the price of common morels like that we have in the Midwest is twice the price of burn morels commercially. Generally speaking, it will be twice the price. Okay, so when I get home now, and this is my preference. First thing I do is I am separating the mushrooms by quality and size. Every single mushroom I do this to. First, I'm separating out all the small ones. I'm trimming the stems so that they're pristine and clean. Any that are damaged or what I call B grade, those go straight into the dehydrator. You're also going to see that I leave the morels whole as much as possible because that gives me more flexibility with what I'm going to do with them after they're rehydrated for the ones that I'm going to dry there. And then the A grade are the ones that are just absolutely picture perfect. And those are going to be saved for eating fresh. But all of the ones on the right are all going to be dried. I like to dry the small ones whole because they're great in soup, leaving them whole. And I look inside the mushroom here. This is how I clean them. This is how I clean most mushrooms. And I'm actually not using cold water here. I am using tepid or even mildly warm water, which is going to seem foreign to some people because cold water does not remove the dirt. And working in a restaurant, warm water removes the dirt better than cold water because things are easy to move around. But you just don't want it to be hot. And the mushrooms are going to be cooled immediately after they are clean. So I'm not soaking them either. All I was doing is swishing them. Now I'll trim some up. I may cut them in half. I might not, but usually I'm going to look inside, and I can peer inside to see if they're going to be clean. And then after I give them a quick swish, then they sit on a paper towel. Now for storing. So this is kind of the anal retentive chef way to do it, is in a hard-sided container, storing the mushrooms as they grow, which is how we store fish and meats too. Like things will be stored vertically as they are on the animal. You're going to see that in a lot of the high-end restaurants. And I'll go over a few different. I think I'm going to go over 3 different ways that I will store them here, just for an example. So if I have hard-sided containers, I'll do that. Most of the time, because I'm probably going to have a bunch of them, I'm going to use paper towels. This is going to help some of the moisture that they've absorbed kind of seep into the towels. And I'm just going to roll them up because we want to cushion them because, morels especially are so brittle. But basically, just about any mushroom I harvest is going to be stored like this. Then I use a plastic bag, not a paper bag, because your home fridge is going to moderate humidity and that's going to dry things out. Okay, here's the Ukrainian way that my friend Olena Johnson has turned me on to. She used to bring me mushrooms layered in beds of ferns. And instead of a paper towel here, I'm going to take some fresh mushrooms and I put a handful of just whatever greens are in my yard, some violets or whatever it is. And you can put the mushrooms in there or do it in a bag. And what that does is it's going to help you moderate the humidity a little bit and keep them fresh. Think of it kind of like a little terrarium. And also when I'm harvesting mushrooms a lot, if I want to separate them, or not have some of them touch each other because maybe they're going to crumble or something, I will take plants. Like burdock leaves are good. I'll put them in my basket and I'll layer the mushrooms in with the plants. It will keep them cooler, it will keep them fresh, and it will keep them separated, which makes them easier to clean. And that is the end of that. Perfect. Okay, we got to work. I told you guys I worked on it. All right. Another kind of high up thing to think about here is that, one thing that we know as mushroom hunters is that every mushroom is unique. This is what's part of that makes it so cool. So they're all unique, but they can all be, generally speaking, you can also interchange them. So, mushroom hunting is just a giant sandbox for cooking because there's so many different things that you can do. So cooking according to the morphology, respecting their shapes is, one of the things that I really like to instill in people. So for example, with the black morels on the left, like I said before, myself and most of my chef friends prefer to leave morels whole if we can look inside and see that they are pristine and clean, because the juices get inside. You get double the morel instead of cutting them in half, unless you have some big giant hogs, hen of the woods, chicken of the woods. The polypores can be so large and so big that you can cook them as a meat substitute in giant pieces if they're very clean. And I'm going to go over one of my favorite ways to do that. Or you can cut them up into smaller pieces if you have a ton of them. But I also like to respect the shapes. If I can, like a hen of the woods, I might just peel it and put the whole piece of mushroom on a plate if I have a very nice one. Then mushrooms with gills and caps, you can cook them like any mushroom from a store, but just keeping in mind that, how can I respect the shape of this ingredient? How can I respect the identity of what I'm cooking I think is a very important thing for me personally. When I was younger, when I started cooking, when I was like 15, I think humans have a natural instinct to really chop things up. Like cooking means chopping and dicing and all kinds of stuff like that. With chanterelles, I almost always, at least of my local species, unless they're very large, I try to keep them whole. Those chanterelles, the ones that can be cooked whole, that are like a mouthful, they can be double the price of other chanterelles. These, they're disseminated by quality through the commercial purveyors because they know how chefs like to cook them. So just another thing to think about. So with those big polypores, mushroom steaks are a great thing to do, especially if you're a vegetarian or you're vegan. I always would keep an option like this on my menus just in case someone came in when I had a steakhouse. Oyster mushrooms are wonderful cooked in clumps. Right now, a lot of people are picking golden oyster mushrooms. I think the flavor of those is fantastic. Hen of the woods, obviously, a lot of people know about those. And I'm going to walk you through the way that I do that. And one of my favorites that unfortunately does not really grow in Minnesota and Wisconsin are cauliflower mushrooms. They require a different method for cooking like this. Oyster mushrooms in a perfect pristine clump, and hen of the woods, they can be put directly into the pan. Cauliflower mushrooms, I wilt or steam them, season them with a little bit of salt, dry them off, dredge them in some flour, and then I fry them under a weight, and you get this thick, crisp, good, get out of here. It's so good with all the little, it's like ribbons of mushroom compressed by the weight of cooking them. But the key is cooking them first to make them obey you so they do what you want. Because if you just put them straight into the pan, that can be kind of difficult.
So Alan, we have a few questions building up. I wanted to know on that picture that you just showed, the previous slide. So was that the cauliflower mushroom on our far right?
Yes, that's a cauliflower on the far right with the Romanesco and the capers.
I cannot wait to eat it that way. That sounds amazing. Okay,
it's so good.
So Hunter was asking about, you had mentioned peeling your maitake, and some of us want to know what you mean by that.
Okay, so taking and this is, I do not do this all the time. Take a piece of the top, and peel the whole thing off and cook it like a giant long piece. There's so many different ways you can do it. I'm not peeling it with a vegetable peeler.
Okay.
So you mean more like shred?
Yes, that would be a better way to describe it.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
That was helpful. And then I think you actually answered this. Some people were asking about, you know, because they've found centipedes, and I know I've found spiders and slugs.
Baby
inside the rows.
snakes
Oh, you
in my
found a
head.
baby snake. Okay, that's
in my head,
interesting.
yes.
Oh my God. Okay. And, you know, we could see actually in your video how carefully you were looking down in there to make sure there wasn't anything in there.
Yeah.
And I appreciate your explanation of how that interior just holds extra sauce. So it's like this flavor bomb when somebody's eating.
Yes.
I can see that's a really good incentive to keep them whole.
Yeah, it really is. It's so many times when I see people cook them, it's just, always in half. Got to make sure that they're cut in half, and you're losing something. You need to try it both. Try it both ways. You got to try cooking them whole, at least once.
I know Kathy Rogers was sharing with us that the Zuni say that bugs add spice to the dish, which, you know, they are used that way a lot as a spice, different bugs.
Ants.
And then one person, Ellen, is asking about, she's growing her own mushrooms. She wants to know your opinion on whether cultivated have less flavor than wild mushrooms.
Yes, absolutely. They have less flavor. For me, it's the substrate. I did so many tests of different mushrooms. When you're running restaurants and you get a little bit of press and people figure out what you like to cook, the samples just fly in. You don't even want them and they just show up at the door. I've tasted so many different commercial maitakes. I got so sick of them. And then I tasted a new one where they were implementing a new process and they had developed their own proprietary substrate that was trying to mimic a natural substrate growing on a hardwood tree. And that company's called D'Artagnan. I do not know if they're still selling them, but that when they started to change the substrate, and this is the same thing with if you eat meat, same thing. Things taste like what they eat. Bison is one of my favorite meats to cook, but I can know immediately when I open up the package what they ate, because I should see pronounced carotene in the fat. It should look yellow, and the meat should look purple because of all the wild grasses and the carotenoids and all these different things that they're eating. Sometimes if they feed them corn, the meat gets extremely pale and it tastes watery. It tastes like pork or something. Same thing with mushrooms. That said, I am an equal opportunity mushroom eater. And if you have a pile of cultivated mushrooms, I'm going to cook and eat those too.
All right.
All right,
Thank
ready
you.
for maitake steaks?
Yes.
So with the maitake steaks, one of the most important things is that you can only do this if you can see that your entire chunk of maitake is pristine and perfectly clean. This can only be done with the most perfect mushrooms you find. With the hen of the woods that I found a baby snake in it, that I threw half of that thing away. It was just like as big as a children's trampoline, and you have to take that apart to clean it. So what I'm doing here is I get the sorry, you gotta get out of here. I take the mushrooms and I put them in the hot pan, and then I'm going to press it down to make it get a little more flat. And I'm just going to try to put some good color on that large chunk of mushroom. And once I can get it flattened out a little bit, and cast iron is the best for this, then I'm going to put a weight on it. And that's just going to kind of keep pressing it. You can see that I was seasoning it with a little salt. And if I don't have to wash these, I won't, because they're going to caramelize better. But even if you have to, it's not going to be bad. But look, now we're getting somewhere. It's going to take a while. This takes some time. But you just keep going until it is golden brown and delicious. Now, at the end, we're going to treat this just like a piece of meat. And the oyster mushrooms are the same way. So this is called the arrosé. This means to water the lawn in French. This is the chef thing that everyone likes to see. You take the butter, and we're using unsalted butter to control the salt. We take garlic that has been crushed, and then fresh thyme leaves. And you can see that the herbs and the garlic are inside of the butter, which should be foaming. You want it to foam because we want the infusion to be going into the fat, because the garlic and the thyme, those flavors, the aromas, their essential oils are very fat soluble. So ideally, they are touching the fat as you are basting here. And you're basting here as long as you like until it looks great to you. And then when it is done, you can carve your roast just like a piece of meat. Voila. Look at that. I just love those. Okay, mushroom cakes, another thing. Somebody mentioned lion's mane cakes or hericium cakes. I make them out of all the hericium that I have. Those are fantastic. There's all kinds of other mushrooms that can be made into cake form. And if I've learned one thing, I mean, if you have my book, you'll know that green cakes are the first recipe in my book. There's a reason for that. It's because everyone loves food in cake form. And this is a great way to use mushrooms. Like if I take mushrooms and I buzz them up to make duxelle, chuck them in the freezer, I can just take the duxelle and drain it a little bit. We can make cakes, you know, and you can do, there's so many different ways that you can flavor them. One of my favorite is the lobster mushroom because it's so firm it can be grated like a potato. But even smaller mushrooms like enoki, there's a Chinese mushroom cake, and I make that one with enoki, lots of scallions. You serve it with the soy dipping sauce. Very, very good. Okay, dry saute and the wet saute. I think a lot of people are going to know about this. And this video goes very fast, so I may have to pause it a little bit. I don't know what I was thinking when I did this. It's like a minute. So this is an example of how I really like to cook. Chanterelles are the poster child for just cooking whole like this. And this is something that I will do. I will do the wet saute if my mushrooms are a little bit dry. And what that means is I'm just adding a little bit of water to the pan, and I'm going to cook the mushrooms because chanterelles also take kind of a reasonably long time to cook, especially when they're nice and thick like this, but they can also overcook if we cook them too long. So if I just cook them, if they're dry and I just cook them in oil, they may overcook a little bit. So the water gives us a little more wiggle room, and we just put a little water in there, tiny pinch of salt, not too much because we're reducing this. And in a little bit, we just cook the water off. Okay, now once the water gets low, we're going to turn the heat down and we prepare to add fat. One thing with this to keep in mind is that we don't want to burn the solutes that are left in the pan, so we're going to make sure to scrape those up. Very good if you want to make a pan sauce. You can see I kind of have gotten the brown bits there. Now we're just going to add a little bit of shallot. You could add some garlic, and I put this in like right at the end. Some fresh herbs, some parsley. Season it until it tastes good to you, and that's not a bad way to cook chanterelles at all. Okay, boiling. Boiling is something that I seem to read about in older mushroom books, and I don't really see people doing a lot. It's something that I use a lot in the fall, specifically when I am cooking honey mushrooms. One of the best ways to preserve your honeys. If you get honey mushrooms, really encourage you to try this with them. But there's also a tradition that is still alive and well around the world of boiling mushrooms just to make them safe. Some of us have probably heard the stories of people from Eastern Europe that pick russelas indiscriminately and just boil them. I haven't tested that out, so you're on your own there. But in South America as well, we see traditions of romaria, especially, as well as lobster mushrooms being boiled before they're sauteed. So really, this is kind of an old way to make mushrooms safe, to make many mushrooms safe that may need extended cooking. But what I use it for is really for preserving large amounts. And like I said, the honeys are very, very good for this. And the best part about them is that they get mucilaginous and kind of slick like okra. And personally, I like serving people slimy food. Honey mushrooms don't make your food slimy. But like other things, I enjoy serving it to people and challenging some of their preconceived notions about it. But they will thicken a soup like very weak cornstarch, and it's just lovely. Very, very good. Weak cornstarch is kind of the best way for me to describe it. So if you haven't tried that, you harvest honey mushrooms, really encourage you to try that. If you dehydrate them, it denatures the mucilaginous properties and you won't get the same effect. So if you don't like that, consider drying your mushrooms. And if I'm going to freeze them, I will often just boil the mushrooms and then put them in their juice, seasoning it with about 0.5% of salt to 1% of salt in the brine if I want, or you can just freeze them as is.
So
Yes.
I have a question about honeys because I've been told that you should cook those for at least 30 minutes. And there are a couple of mushrooms that I've been told that about.
30 minutes. I've never cooked honeys for 30 minutes. They need to be thoroughly cooked for sure, but 30 minutes it's kind of extreme from my perspective. I would not agree with that at all. I've served them to the general public. I know a lot of mycological societies do not allow them at their forays, but boiling is such an ancient human tradition. It has made far more dangerous things than honey mushrooms edible for a very long time. Personal opinion there. So I'll cook honey mushrooms in a soup, and I said to like boil a mushroom for 5 minutes there. They're also being cooked after that. They may many times you cannot saute them. So they're going to be cooking for at least 30 minutes in a soup or stew. So don't be misled by my boiling timeline that I had there, because I'm not taking them out of the pan and just eating them after 5 minutes.
Okay.
It is a par cooking method. So thanks. That needed some clarification.
Yeah, great.
Roasting is another good thing to do. And this I will do with mushrooms where I have large amounts of them. So the shrimp of the woods are good. Hen of the woods are good. Great way to take a whole bunch of mushrooms and cook them down into like a crispy, roasty, juicy little nubbin. One thing I've been doing this with oyster mushrooms, with the golden oysters that I've been finding a lot of. I will take them, I'll cook a whole baking sheet at a time, and it works like a charm. This is how I do it with hens. So this I'm actually doing with cultivated hens. And I'm just going to break them into larger pieces. Pick them into pieces. Then we're going to toss them with some oil. You want to use a decent amount of oil. There's some actually dried bee balm I'm adding. Salt, garlic. And if your hens are cultivated, you probably don't need to wash or rinse them. That can make it a little more difficult. Now I'll season them a little bit, and you can see that they're not overlapping. I don't want to crowd. The most important thing is to not crowd the pan when you're doing this. So you may need to do 2, 3, 4 baking trays like that to get them to look perfectly golden brown like that. Okay, the OG restaurant version includes more herbs. So basically I'll take larger sprigs and I'll mix them with the mushrooms. So the little poultry mix that you can get at the store is fine, but I'll break the mushrooms into pieces. This is not the way that I do it at home all the time, but I include it just kind of for reference there. Again, I'm going to oil them, salt, and then just the whole herbs. So this is more of a way to just perfume them if I don't want lots of herbs on them. And then I added a little bit of garlic too.
So Alan, would you say, I know you have the silpat on there, so if people don't have those, because a lot of
Parchment.
parchment paper, excellent.
And you can see that the herbs go underneath the mushrooms. We're going to get transference of the aroma, and their oils comes out and it's going to go up. So the herbs go underneath. Sometimes we just cook them on a bed of them, or you can just toss them too. Like I said, this is kind of the anal retentive chef way to do it. But there you go. 2 different ways to roast mushrooms. Okay, eating mushrooms raw. This is one I won't spend too much time on this, but this is another topic that people can get really fired up about. And I do not eat a lot of wild mushrooms raw at all. It is a novelty, but generally speaking, but we have traditions around the world that I don't think should be disregarded, because some of them are so crazy good that I think everyone should try them at least once. Eating Amanita caesarea in Provence, there's tables just filled with mushrooms, and they just have the Caesar's mushroom cut into pieces, just bowls of them, and bowls of olive oil and salt. And people just walk by and they take a mushroom, put it in the oil, and everyone is eating the Caesar's mushroom raw. It's excellent. Porcini are like that. If you live in a place that is not like where I live, where your porcini are perfect and without bugs, because finding a perfect porcini where I live is like, it's like the holy grail. Like that never happens. But sometimes I do. Or if I order Boletus Rex Ferus, they're very, very good like that. Matsutake are probably one of my favorites to eat raw. And they're served like that in some sushi restaurants in Japan. That's where I learned about it. And really a fantastic way to taste their flavor. Just like pine, and just a very pure way to taste their flavor. And one of the things that people will bring up is they will say that, oh, mushrooms are made of chitin. Like, you don't eat crab shells, so don't ever eat mushrooms raw. Well, humans eat things for pleasure all the time that maybe they might have, a problem digesting. And corn is the perfect example. We eat corn. We can't digest corn at all unless the corn has been nixtamalized. So if you have tortillas or tortilla chips, they've been nixtamalized, which is the chemical process that denatures the seed coat of the corn and makes it completely digestible. Hominy has been nixtamalized. So that's also why when the colonists came over and then took corn from the New World to Africa, all of the people they had doing their dirty work got pellagra, which is a nutrient deficiency, because they couldn't digest corn, because they did not take the secret from the people consuming corn. But I digress. Truffles. Okay, truffles are a good example of mushrooms they eat raw, even though I know they're a ball of mycelium. And a few fun truffles here, if you are a truffle phagist like I am. The Blue Ridge truffles are kind of close to you guys, and I got to try those this year. And they smell like truffle and taste like a little bit of cheese, like Parmesan cheese truffles. They're very good. The honey truffles from Hungary. I was contributing to a book only on honey truffles from Hungary. And these are one of the strangest things that I've ever eaten. They taste like a mix of saccharin and blue cheese, and they kind of smell like truffle. Some things I made with them were good. Some things were very bad. So honey truffles, if you have the opportunity, try them.
Do you know the species name for that one?
Yeah, I think it used to be, I want to say it used to be in Terfezia. It's they're cousins to it. If you just look up Hungarian honey truffle, you'll find it. Yeah, it's on the tip of my tongue. Okay, preserving mushrooms. We're going to go over drying, pickling, freezing, freeze drying, and sauces and condiments. So basic how-to on drying mushrooms. Sometimes personal preference here. Sometimes I clean all my mushrooms. Ideally, I'm cleaning all my mushrooms when I get home. I may be exposing them to water, and then I'm going to dry them after they have been cleaned. If I'm really busy, if I went out and I picked a bunch of stuff, or if it was like last week when a company messed up and sent me 6 pounds of morels the size of my pinky nail rolled in dirt, they're going straight into the dehydrator. So it's kind of how much time you have and your personal preference. But one of the reasons that I make clean mushrooms and then specifically label them, clean them before I dry them, is then I can grind them into a powder and I don't have to worry about putting dirt in my food because I do not like to eat grit. I am allergic to grit in mushrooms. So, once again, treat your mushrooms like food, clean them before you put them in the basket. It's going to make everything easier, but it does take a little more concentration when you're out in the field. So we want to cut our mushrooms into thin slices generally, or some mushrooms can just be dried whole, and then that gives you a little more flexibility with what you want to do with them after they're rehydrated. Shaggy manes, if you get them early enough, you can dehydrate them, and those have been very good. Then properly dried and improperly dried. When a mushroom is properly dried, it should retain some of its color, and it should not lose too much weight. If we look at the trumpets, I sacrificed trumpets for that picture and left them out. And sometimes that just happens with black trumpets too, as you're picking them and drying them. But the mushrooms on the left, we can see are black and they're shriveled. And that means they died during the dehydration process for all intents and purposes. They went bad while they were drying, and then you dried a bad mushroom that you wouldn't have wanted to eat at the state that it was in. And what happens is they lose extra weight, they seem to lose extra volume, and then they shrivel, and they're not going to kill you if you boil them, but it's not proper procedure. And then I store them in a jar. I will dry mushrooms for days on end until I know that they're perfectly cracker dry. Cooking with dried mushrooms. So the basic protocol is I'm going to soak them to remove any grit. If I have any kind of question about how clean they might be, if they're very clean, then I'll grind them up into a powder. I might do something with that, all kinds of things, and I'll go over one of my favorite ways here quick. Toasting dried mushrooms is something that we don't often think about too much, and that can be a fun way to play with and tweak flavors a little bit. So in the pan there on the bottom, I'll toast the mushrooms and just put a little bit of color on them. It doesn't take very long, just until you can see like a little bit of golden on them. And then what I do with those is I grind them up and I spin them into an aioli. Lemon, garlic, a little bit of thyme. It's very good. Other great things to do with dried mushrooms, like making rubs. Lobster mushrooms are one of the most fun that I use, because you get a concentration of their flavor because they're pretty mild, fresh. You can add a few other things, but I don't like to add a ton of stuff. I like it to be like 80% mushroom at least. Risotto is a great thing to do with your dried mushrooms if you have a bunch, or making mushroom stuffings. Generally speaking, we're looking for places when we're cooking with dried mushrooms. I'm usually looking for places where I can use broth and the physical pieces of mushroom at the same time. In my book, the only mushroom recipe in my book, which is focused on edible plants, is chili crisp. And I add a whole bunch of dried mushrooms to Chinese fermented black beans, hot chilies, and a bunch of oil and wild Szechuan peppercorns or Szechuan peppercorns from the store. That is a fantastic way to use dried mushrooms. It'll keep basically forever in the fridge. Put it on anything and everything. Okay, a really fun one. I have a venison tenderloin, just for example. This is how to crust a piece of meat with mushrooms. Very easy, very good. And you really get a pure flavor out of this. So what I've done is I just took morels, and what's a more classic pairing than venison morels? But any kind of round piece of meat, like a pork tenderloin, is perfect with this. But you can do it with just about anything. But I like something that is smaller and roundish because it makes it kind of easier to cook. I grind the mushrooms up, and these were the clean mushrooms that we ground up. But first, I season the piece of meat with salt and pepper before I put it into the mushroom powder. I do not make seasoned mushroom blends because that takes away the control I have over the salt. You always want to have control over your salt. So I never put salt in any mushroom powder or blend unless it's going to become condiment. And we just take that piece of meat after it's sat with the salt a little bit. What's the salt going to do? It's going to draw moisture out of the meat. So we don't need to brush this with egg. We don't need to coat this in flour. The natural water of the meat comes to the surface, and then we roll it completely again and again, just like you're doing a rolling pin in the pure ground mushrooms. Now, with cooking, I like to warm up a pan with a little bit of butter because you're not cooking at a heat that is going to be high enough to burn this, because this is pure something dehydrated. We're not cooking in a pan. It can be easy to burn. So you are looking for medium to medium high heat at the max. And you just want to make sure to watch it. And when everything is nice and toasted and golden brown and the house smells like all the good things in life, you're ready to eat. Mushroom butters are another great way to use dried mushrooms. And I do them a couple different ways. If I have them fresh and I have the time, porcini and the boletes, cut into pieces and cook down with shallots until the mushrooms get a nice color on them. That is fresh. That is fantastic, pureed and whipped into a fresh mushroom butter. Dried mushroom butters mean that we're going to cook the liquid down. We're going to rehydrate them, get any dirt out, and then cook the liquid down almost to what we'd say almost a sec, or almost until the pan is dry, because too much liquid in the mushroom butter can cause it to separate when it's in the fridge or if it's in the freezer, and that is not ideal. One of the best things to put on a piece of meat or just to toss, one of the best quick pasta sauces. Oh, I don't know what I'm gonna have for dinner. I got in from the field. I have a pan full of greens. I have a little mushroom butter in the freezer. Cook some pasta, toss it together. One of my favorite things to eat when I don't have a lot of time. Soups and stocks, great for woody trim and buggy mushrooms. Best tip I can give you here, use any mushroom you want. Use dried mushrooms, use the ends of woody polypores are some of my favorites, but do not use too many carrots. If anything, skip the carrots entirely. Carrots are different from onions and celery. You can make up your own mirepoix. I have an essay in my book that talks about that. You can make up your own mirepoix. Like a white mirepoix would be leek, onion, celery, or maybe even celery root. I'm using one like that for a borscht that I'm making tomorrow for at the bed and breakfast here. But carrots will add sugar. And if you add too many carrots, which is easy to do, and you're cooking this for a very long time and you're reducing it, you're going to end up with something that tastes like carrot stock, and you're not going to taste the mushrooms at all. So there is nothing wrong with taking one rib of celery, one clove of garlic, a single bay leaf, and a whole bunch of mushrooms and making stock out of that. So do not feel like you have to add all these other ingredients when you make mushroom stock. You can add different flavors later. The most important thing is that it tastes pure, and it tastes a way that is pleasing to you. So skip the carrots.
So Alan, we had a few questions. I just want to backtrack a tiny bit. Somebody was asking, when you did that mushroom crusted venison, did you have butter or oil in the pan?
I used butter. You could use a combination, because the heat that you're using, a lot of times we're not going to sear a piece of meat in butter because the butter is going to burn. But if you're cooking it on a low heat, it does not take long at all to brown that mushroom crust because it has no moisture. So you can use butter, oil, or you can use a combination.
I actually wanted to know if you didn't put any oil on the meat before putting the mushroom powder on, correct?
No, because that will make it clump.
Okay, that's what I was asking.
Yep. Only salt. And I can put the link in the chat for that later or something.
Right. And I like how you pointed out that the salt was drawing the moisture out, and then the moisture is sitting on the outside, and then that's how the crust sticks to the meat. I thought that was
the key.
Great. Then Marcia is asking about those black trumpets. that were not dried properly, or like you said, they looked dead before they dried. Whether you've tried making powders out of those, because I think she's done that. So,
Yeah, I don't have piles of improperly dried black trumpets, so I haven't really tried that. But you could sure, they're not going to hurt you. Like, it's fine. But you got to remember, I'm very picky and I'm very opinionated when it comes to food because food is all I know. So, if it happens, and it happens a lot with black trumpets, just because they're so like thin and fragile, it'll happen sometimes. I use that just as an example so people can see the color difference. Because one thing that I do see that I kind of drives me nuts is with morels. And I've been in like the man caves of Wisconsin where all they do is set up screens in the garage. And like I've seen so many morels that are dead before they are dried. And then by the time they're dried, they're like this big, and it's just a shame. You could be getting a lot more enjoyment out of your mushrooms that way. But yeah, it's totally harmless to save them and powder them if you like. Nothing wrong with that.
and then Amy's asking whether there are any other kinds of fats you like to use besides olive oil or butter with mushroom. Any other fats you like to use with a mushroom?
Of course, that depends on the season. Depends on what I have. If I'm cooking with meat, I typically cook with the fat of that animal. So a goat is cooked with goat tallow. Lamb is cooked with lamb fat. Beef is cooked with beef fat. Poultry is cooked with poultry fat. That is a perfect world. Sometimes I need to mix and match. I just rendered 100 pounds of goat tallow last week, so I'm probably going to be using that in all kinds of things. That being said, you need to know the fat that you're using. For mushrooms, poultry fat is one of the finest. So chicken fat, duck fat is incredible because these are they're not like pork lard, and they're definitely not like beef tallow or the tallow of ruminants because they have a very low melting point. And duck fat especially is going to be, it's almost more like oil than it is like like an animal fat. So it's very light, it's not heavy. That's a great one. I would cook mushrooms in duck fat all day if I could. So definitely a good one to use. People sell jars of it, so you don't have to render your own now.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Okay, great mushroom broths that you need to try. Yellowfoot chanterelles. Not a lot of hunters pick these in Minnesota and Wisconsin. I think they get overlooked. Once you try this very simple, it's just like mushrooms cooked in a little bit of stock with a little bit of pasta and some parsley. It might be the only thing you make with yellow feet. And many different mushrooms can be cooked like that. Trumpets can't because I'm talking about, this is a lot of mushrooms in like a bowl of soup. But trumpets will get bitter. Some mushrooms will get bitter. But that is probably my favorite thing I've ever made with the very small chanterelles with the yellow feet. Lactarius. Most of the lactarius that I harvest, if I dehydrate them, they make a very special mushroom broth that is light in body and is the best way that I can describe it is almost tasting like chicken stock. They have like a chicken stocky quality, like vegetarian chicken stock. Just a really, really good one. If you have the voluminous milky or saffron milk caps, both of those, I've had great success with those. Lactarius volumus was the other one, if they haven't changed the name. And then pheasant backs. Most of the time people see pheasant backs and they're huge. I still kind of laugh when I see people putting pictures up in the Minnesota mushroom pages on Facebook. They're like, I found a great pheasant back. It's like this big. I'm like, this is gonna be the toughest thing that you ever ate. But you can make stock and it's good. And it loses some of the farinaceous cucumbery aroma, and it just gets a little bit more mushroomy. And I don't know, maybe my favorite is a black standing polypore. I don't know if you guys have those down there. We don't have a lot, so when I find one, it's really, really special. And it's one of the best mushroom broths that I've had because they make a stock. I mean, the mushrooms kind of taste like a hen of the woods had a baby with a black trumpet. They're so cool.
Oh my God, that's hilarious.
That's what it is.
Great description.
The black trumpet, and they had a baby. Okay, pickling mushrooms. The importance of pH with mushrooms, a lot of mushroom recipes out there and mushrooms that are sold commercially, they're very tart for me. And I feel like the people that make them are trying to assassinate the mushrooms with vinegar. So a few years ago, we actually had a commercial market at Heartland where we would sell preserves. So sometimes I might be prepping for service, and then I'm going to make 30 jars of pickles today because we got a lot of beets or whatever we had. So I needed to know how to make things safe and then sell them to the general public so the restaurant doesn't get sued. And we would get a lot of mushrooms, and obviously we want to pickle. The pH that we found, we started to do tests because I was not pleased with some of the mushroom pickles people were making. I said, this is too sour. Like, I cannot cook with this. I need to soak it in water to get the vinegar off. So what we did is we tried to find where the pH gets to about under 3.5 should be fine for most pickles. We wanted to find, okay, what is the ratio of water to vinegar that makes this safe? And guess what we found? We found that at a certain point, adding more vinegar, and it didn't really even matter which vinegar it was, adding more vinegar to a mushroom pickle did not lower the pH and became completely unnecessary because we did this with pH testers. So that was super fascinating to me. So I started to adjust. Yes, it was an aha moment for us. I think I jumped up and down and said, we're going to be able to make mushroom pickles that taste good. And I started to adjust my recipes there. And the recipes for mushroom pickles on my website are all derived from the mother recipe that I developed for commercial sale to the public at that restaurant. Another thing that people talk about is that gets discussed. I had a great discussion with Hank Shaw about this on the podcast that we did on mushroom preservation a little while ago. And that was sugar in mushroom pickles. Yes or no? This is a personal preference. I say most of the time, absolutely not. I don't want sugar in my mushroom pickles. This is a personal preference. Maybe you just love your mushroom pickle recipes that has sugar in it. If you generally use a recipe that uses sugar, I would invite you to try one of mine that does not have sugar. That said, after I put this presentation together, I went to Finland and I got to pick mushrooms with a fantastic Swedish chef named Sammy Tallberg, who has a book on wild food out. And one of the things we made for this marketing campaign we were working on, actually with the Fiskars group, was the Scissors people. We were making Sammy's pickled chanterelles, and they just kind of threw me in there. And cups and cups and cups of sugar. It was like equal parts sugar, vinegar, and mushrooms. And it was not that bad, but it had tons of juniper in it. So I may make Sammy's pickled chanterelles with juniper. You need to be careful with the seasonings there. So it's not my first choice, but I may have some once in a while. I didn't change my tune, but I didn't tell them that I didn't like pickled mushrooms with sugar. Now, even more important, I made all these mushroom pickles. What the heck do I do with them now? The most fun of mushroom pickles is making the mushroom pickles. No, the most fun of mushroom pickles is picking the mushrooms. You know, I know lots of friends that have jars of mushroom pickles they've made, and people say, well, what do I do? Do I just eat them cold out of the jar? That seems like a punishment. So mushroom pickles, when I cook with them at restaurants, I would pickle 80 pounds of mushrooms at my steakhouse every single week. And not a single one of them was ever served cold. They were warmed up and used in a similar way that I would fresh mushrooms. This is one of the biggest tips I can give you for cooking with mushrooms that have been preserved or marinated like this, is don't think of them as a pickle. Think of, how can I use this mushroom? But you can use them in ways where maybe their acidity is a counterpoint to something rich. A great example is putting them on, okay, we opened up one restaurant I was at with a cream of sweet onion soup with a pile of pickled chanterelles on top. And maybe if the chanterelles that I have, maybe we pickled some and they're very sour. They're really tart and sharp. And those mushrooms are also warm. They're warmed up before they're being put onto the soup, because we don't just need to, like I said, eating mushrooms cold out of the jar kind of sounds like a punishment to me and some people. I like to heat them up, wake them up a little bit, like, oh, hey, mushrooms, how you doing? It's time to join the party. This is one appetizer I did for a mushroom dinner for my friend's book, Untamed Mushrooms. Very good book. He's also in Minnesota, Mr. Michael Carnes. And we served a mix of pickled and fresh mushrooms to serve with flatbread. And there's a big swash of, a big swipe of whipped goat cheese on the plate. And then there's salad. And it's kind of a choose your own adventure dish. But again, the focal point is all about this pile of mushrooms. So don't think about pickled mushrooms as something cold. Think about pickled mushrooms as something you can have cold if you prefer them cold, but you can use them warm too. Just about any way that you would use a fresh mushroom. Okay, freezing mushrooms. This is such a quandary sometimes, and I get so many interesting emails about this. What happened? What did I do wrong? You explained this, and somehow it ruined my mushrooms, and I hate you. Whatever the email is. Sometimes people, they may misread things. There could be user error. Freezing mushrooms is a fantastic way to preserve them. Some of them, there's like a golden few that can be frozen raw and like don't suffer for it. And if you have some to add to my list, feel free to drop them in the chat if you've had success with them, because I'd like to try some more, because sometime I'm actually going to write my mushroom book. I've just been so busy. Hen of the woods can work. Matsutake are some of the best. I made miso soup with matsutake for 5 people from Japan about 3 weeks ago, and they absolutely loved it, and it tasted like matsutake. I could not believe it. I did not think that the flavor was going to transfer. And I was like, oh, well, of course, I'm going to make matsutake miso soup. It was incredible. And those, I just did the David Aurora technique. I just wrapped them in foil, but then I put that into a plastic bag. Huitlacoche, if you've had corn smut, this is a luxury. Not a lot of people have access to corn fields where the corn is of a variety that you would want to put inside your body. So, having a nice organic cornfield. I have a friend that grows, he will be the largest supplier of corn smut in North America this year, if he is not already. He's going to be supplying places in Mexico City, and he got an order for 10,000 pounds last year. Mushroom Mike, and he will sell some to you frozen. It's not as expensive as some of the other purveyors, and it's grown in Wisconsin on good corn. But Huitlacoche freezes like a dream. Question?
Well, actually, once again, you said the David Aurora method, and I think not everybody's familiar with that. So
you wrap matsutake in foil and put them in the freezer.
Okay, that's the David Aurora method. Okay, great. All right, thank you.
But I put them in plastic after that.
Okay, and then Hunter is actually asking a question about the Huitlacoche.
Yeah, shoot.
Off the cobs or just cobs? I'm not sure. Hunter, do you want to get on here and explain your question a little bit?
Yeah, just freezing them. Would you take them off the cob, or like just throw the whole cob in the freezer?
Well, when I'm harvesting, I'm probably bringing home 50 to 60 pounds, and that is of product only cut off the cob. And what we do is we IQF it, and that's called individually quick frozen. That means we're going to take a baking sheet at home. So easy to do at home. And this is what I recommend with you do this with the matsutake too. Take a baking sheet, put a piece of parchment on it, put your mushrooms on there, and then put them into the freezer. And then after it's frozen, all the mushrooms are not going to stick together, and you can put them into something, you can vacuum seal them, and it just really works like a charm. But we have to be careful with some mushrooms, freezing them raw. Freezing has a horrible effect on some mushrooms. Puffballs and hericium are 2 of the worst that I've encountered, but this is only when they're frozen raw. And what happens is you will see it. I'd never seen it. I don't know what it is. They must share some sort of compound or something, or have some sort of similarity, because they turn this dingy yellow after they've been frozen. And usually things don't change color when I put them in the freezer. And then when you thaw them, it is like this liquid comes out that's just foul. It's like a liquid gym sock or something. It's just terrible. They go right into the trash. So save yourself some trouble and just cook. If you don't know if the mushroom can be frozen raw, cook them before you do it. And how I do it is my basic freezing method is I cook the mushrooms, and you can see I've used butter on these because butter solidifies when it's cool, so it makes it easier to vacuum seal. But the best is I'll cook them in a little bit of fat, whatever fat that is, and I'll season them with salt. And the salt is important because what can happen sometimes is we take something out of the freezer. I do this all the time, and I might forget about it when I take it out of the freezer. Oh, something came up. Oh, I got to go out to a dinner I forgot about. Oh, next thing you know, the mushrooms from the freezer that you picked and did not season with salt have been in your fridge for 4 days. If you season them with salt, you will not have that problem. If you need a benchmark for how much to season them, 0.5% to 1% of the mushroom's weight in salt is basically standard. And instead of them, going bad in a few days, they could last for a week or more if they're out of the fridge. So salt is incredibly important because, nobody wants to eat mushrooms that have gone off. But the best way to do this here, and this is what I did with, the greatest chicken in the woods I picked in my life last year. Cook the mushrooms in some fat, add some salt, put them into Ziploc bags, and then put those individual portions into a vacuum bag. Seal that. This is a long bag. I cut when I need some. I cut it. I take the mushrooms out, whatever that portion is. I like a pound or 8 ounces. Both of those are good kind of benchmarks depending on how many people you're feeding. When you open the bag, then you reseal the vacuum bag, and then you put it back in the freezer. That might sound like a lot of work, but I can assure you that freezer burn is real, and vacuum sealing is the best method to prevent against freezer burn and wasting those things that you went out, got all excited to find, and then spent, if you're like me, spent hours outside cleaning your Rubbermaid tub full of mushrooms or whatever you have. Sauces. Sauces can be fun. A fun way to use buggy or damaged mushrooms. I have a kind of a shoyu. It's like a light soy sauce made from pheasant backs that I've fermented with koji rice on the left-hand side. And that comes out like nice and clear, this not clear, but this kind of opaque orange. And that is a great thing. If you like mushroom noodle soups like ramen and things like that, get out of here. It's so good. And that it takes a little bit of time. Very good. Mushroom ketchup. Every single mushroom will make like a different kind of ketchup. That's the old Civil War type recipe. And they would do it in Europe too, where mushrooms are cooked down with a little bit of salt and some seasonings, and then the sauce is bottled. So I have a modern version that has an extended shelf life because it incorporates vinegar that is cooked down with the liquid. It doesn't taste like you put a bunch of vinegar in it, but it extends the shelf life, and it makes it so that you're not going to grow mold on it in the fridge, which traditional mushroom ketchup, you can definitely get mold on it in the fridge. So that is a great way to, if you have just a ton of them. One thing I'll say is I don't use the pores of mature boletes. I like to trim those off. Someone tried to make it with only the pores, and it got very viscous, and they sent a horrible video on it. So yeah, I do appreciate people testing things with all these different species of mushrooms. I could have never imagined that when I started doing this like 10 years ago. Mushroom soy sauce too is a good one. Just put your dried mushrooms into a jar. I like to cover them with soy sauce. You can use fresh too, and you let that sit out. It might ferment a little bit. That's not a bad thing. Strain it after like 30 days, and that's a fantastic dipping sauce for all kinds of things. Okay, duxelle is a classic preservation method that saves space. Good for so many different mushrooms. I'm going to do this with hen of the woods or maitakes because they're one of the best, and they're one of the ones that I most commonly make into a preserve like this because they can have so much surface area. I'll use a blend, and it's good when you have a mix of them. It's like, oh, I have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. You can add the different ones together. I'm just using the whole mushrooms here. Here I'm picking them apart. If you have a mushroom that is mild tasting, adding shiitakes. Shiitakes are probably my favorite cultivated mushroom just because the flavor is dependably awesome. It's dependably good. But I cut them into pieces. Then we're going to pulse them. We do not puree them. I'm pulsing. You're trying to mimic the texture of being coarsely chopped with a knife without having to go through the labor of coarsely chopping them with the knife. Because when we're doing this with a hen of the woods, you could be doing it with a 10-pound mushroom. I do not have time to chop that by hand. I don't think anyone does or should. So we grind them up and put them in there. Then we're going to take a shallot. Shallots love mushrooms. And this is a good little tutorial on how to dice them. If you haven't worked with them before, I'm using a very small, sharp knife. So I'm making horizontal cuts, and I leave the root on because if you saute mushrooms, anytime you saute mushrooms, a handful of shallots at the end, a little handful, is a great way to finish them. You get a little bit of onion, a little bit of garlic, but not too much. And they are the traditional allium that is used in duxelle. But that said, you can just make it without it too. You can just grind them up, pulse them, and cook them, season them, and not add anything else. And then they're like a blank slate and just make mushroom cakes later. So I'm going to cook the shallots until it gets a little brown, until I can see it's just starting to get a little bit of color. Now I'm going to add the mushrooms. And one thing that's important here is I'm not going to try to brown these mushrooms. If you try to brown these, you would need so much oil, and you would also need like a 30-inch pan. It's just not going to happen. It's like trying to brown ground beef. It's never really going to caramelize unless you cook a whole slab of ground beef because the water's coming up. And you can see I'm making sure to watch the bottom, so I don't want that to scorch. There's some sherry. Sherry is very traditional, but you can see that I'm not trying to brown this at all. All I'm trying to do is remove the water. And my special trick here for making duxelle that actually tastes good is going to come up in a little bit. If you want, you can add some dried porcini. And then I'll add kind of the liquid there. Okay, the secret. So there was not a lot of caramelization on that duxelle. You know, it's very blonde, and there's not a ton of flavor in that. You might taste it and be like, this doesn't taste incredible. Everyone talks about duxelle being so good. So we need more surface area. So like I said before, we would have needed like a 30-inch pan. So what I do is I spread it on the silpat, and then we bake it at high heat. Boom, there we go. Now we got duxelles that are golden brown and caramelized, and they have more flavor. And this will not be necessary for some species that don't have a lot of natural water. The yellowfoot chanterelles, I would not do it with them. And there, see, I baked it twice. You can just keep doing it and keep building the caramelization until it's perfect for you. But black trumpets are another one. I would not do that with them either. A few derivative things. So you can freeze the duxelle in ice cube trays. You can use it in stuffing. There's a venison loin wrapped in caul fat. You can add that to sauces like the pan sauce there. Or one of my favorites is a sauce for steamed fish. That one's actually made with minced venison trotters and mushrooms. Mushroom ravioli filling, excellent. And you can also grill hen of the woods if you don't want to cook them in a pan and then put them in the food processor afterward. So see, you can kind of, as long as you're browning it and getting some of the moisture out, you can switch the order of some things as long as you know what you want to do. Okay. Underused species, everyone should know that I think everyone should know. Here, I don't know if you guys have this one. This is Hemiluxinum subglobripes, and it's like a Luxinum, but it doesn't really have the scabers on the stalk. They're just excellent, and just this pure golden yellow to them. They like to grow up with tamarack and hemlock up here. Like I talked about before, the black staining polypore. This mushroom needs to get more play. This is an excellent mushroom. I see people calling this trash all the time. It's not the mushroom's fault if you don't know how to make it taste good. This is a learned skill. Mushroom cookery is a learned skill, just like mushroom hunting is a learned skill. So one of my favorite things to do is I take them and I make duxelle out of them. And then that could go, I put it in an ice cube tray and then vacuum seal them. I mix them like 25% with ground beef to make hamburgers. Very, very good. Or take that ice cube of duxelle and put it into a little risotto like we talked about before. And we talked about the broth that comes off of them is one of the best. Also a great tip for making your mushroom broth, use a crock pot. There's something about the ceramic liner and the low temperature. It's not going to boil. You're going to make it is my go-to. My secret is a crock pot for making ramen broths and things like that, where I want the broth crystal clear. If you put it in a stock pot or a pasta pot, it's way too easy for the heat to go up and for it to start to boil. And that's going to emulsify any oil that you use to sweat the vegetables, and that is going to make your broth cloudy. So use a crock pot. They're great. Chefs love them. Yes.
So Becca has a question. She said her black staining polypore stock turned kind of a gray-black color. Is there some way to prevent that? She said it tasted great, but any way to avoid the color change?
I haven't had that happen. If it does happen, just go embrace it.
I wonder if it's the temperature. So you have your crock pot on low the whole time? Is that?
Yeah, low.
Okay. So I'm wondering if the black color has anything to do with the temperature. It'd be interesting to try cooking at 2 different temperatures and see what happens. So.
Yeah, I don't know. So with that, I would just roll with it. And looks like we're making dark colored mushroom soup.
So Jeff Mossberg is saying that he's going to send you his money now for your mushroom book. Do you know when that might be coming out, or when you might be?
Next question.
Okay, yeah,
I know.
ask that question a lot. All right, that's good.
Okay, so the Luxinums. I just love these mushrooms for so many different reasons, and they're also the only mushroom that I have poisoned myself with. You know, they taught me a very important lesson, and that's to respect the ingredient, because it was not the mushroom's fault that I cut it into thin slices and put it into a cold bowl, poured hot stock over it, and thought that I was going to have Luxinums with consomme. What happened is that they need thorough cooking, just like the honey mushrooms that we talked about before. And I basically essentially ate them raw. And then I was, sick for a day and a half. So I do not serve these fresh. I do not eat these fresh myself, but I harvest them any time that I see them, because once you dry them, I struggle to find a mushroom that makes a better powder for crusting meat, for making seasonings, for adding to everything from breads to pastries or whatever you want to make, because they're so dark and the flavor is so good. When they're fresh, they're very mild. But the most important thing to talk about here is that drying is basically one of your first safeguards for making mushrooms safe. So I've never had a single issue after my issue with the Luxinums. I've never had an issue serving them to anyone. Obviously, I ate them myself first after they were dried, and I've never had a problem ever. So drying is a way to make mushrooms safe before you cook them with some different species. But these are one of the best for adding to breads and things like that. Okay,
So
the pheasant
Alan,
back. Yes.
oh, what's the proportion of the powder that you tend to add to the breads that you had those?
Oh, the recipe for that is on my website. It's
Okay, great.
slightly complicated. I don't know the ratio offhand. That took a very long time to make.
Okay. Thanks.
And you are not adding powder directly to that will not give you a transfusion of flavor. There's a process. You need to cook it and awaken it. You need to cook it in like its own juices and make a paste. You cannot just do not just add dried mushroom flour. You need to substitute it for a proportion of the water and the oil and the flour, essentially, which sounds a lot more complicated than it is.
Right. She's making the dong thing, the little flour paste thing, something that makes the milk bread moist and stuff like that. That's what it sounds like. That's interesting.
Yeah, it will kind of function like that. Basically, it's the only way you can make a bread actually taste like mushrooms.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right.
So the pheasant backs, I feel like these get kind of a bad rap too. And I'd love to talk about these because they're great for people that are new. They're great for people that maybe they don't know how to identify a chanterelle. They don't know what a hen of the woods is, but they want to go out and look for morels because they know those, and they end up finding tons of pheasant backs. And then they get pissed off because they think the mushrooms don't taste good. But once again, it's not the mushrooms' fault. And some people just don't like them. I understand that. But the key with these is that they have a critical period for harvesting. And that's when the pore structure is very small, and you need to thinly slice them. They want to be shaved on a mandolin. I do not slice these with a knife personally. I basically only use a mandolin just because the results are so good. Just these thin ribbons, but they're still firm enough that they keep their texture. And I think the crowd favorite so far, that is again, a perfect easy recipe for beginners is it's called white wine pheasant backs. And it's just something I made for someone I was cooking dinner for a few years ago, just riffing in the kitchen. And I was like, oh, well, this sounds good. And then they ate it and they're like, oh, this is very, very good. And I was like, oh, I think it is. Yeah. Some of the best things are made in the moment, cooking for someone that you care about. So that's how I cook pheasant backs. One of the best ways. Just keep in mind, just the shaving. You can cook them any way you like, but shave them, hold them by the base, and shave them with a mandolin. If you don't have a mandolin, just get one. You need one in your life if you eat food. Cool thing about pheasant backs too. So I learned this, and I don't think that I'm covered under the NDA agreement anymore. So I will share this with you. If you like mushroom crafts, which I know many of us do, the stem of the pheasant back is like rock hard. Go find a very large pheasant back stem and dry it whole, and then sand it with sandpaper. And it's like the coolest balsa wood substitute that you've ever had. It's so cool. And they keep part of the pattern on them. I'm telling you, it's awesome. There's a brand new textile industry here. It's untapped. Okay, resinous polypore. I don't know if you guys have this one, but this is such a cool mushroom to find. There's so many cool polypores, and we're just eating the tender margin there, but very good. I call it beef of the woods or Salisbury steak of the woods. I think we need a new common name. Now, here's a few just uses for common species. So black trumpets are so incredibly versatile. One of the only mushrooms I know that can be savory or they can be sweet. There's candied black trumpets up on the top, and then trumpet mushroom jam with butternuts that I crack and a little bit of cheese on the crackers in the top right, or crusting of venison rib chop on the bottom. And again, that is the same way that I did the morels. If you ever see that with meat that I've done, it's going to be like the same way every time. Salt, roll the meat in as many mushrooms as you can afford, put it into the pan, don't burn it. And that's kind of hard with black trumpets because they are black. lobster mushrooms. So they have a mild taste, fresh, but when they're dried, it concentrates. But one of the coolest things is that they are very, very firm. And they one of the kind of aha moments I had with these was looking just like I do with plants, and is looking at ethnomycological traditions that we will see around the world. How does someone in a different culture around the world use this mushroom? What can I learn from them? And there's a cool lesson that I learned I'll talk about at the end. So these are great for vegetarian and vegan dishes. Mushroom ratatouille. I just sub them in instead of the zucchini. You guys, lobster mushrooms are so much more fun in ratatouille than just zucchini. Great way to cook them. And they don't have a lot of flavor fresh. So you cook them with tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, basil, and the herbs. And it's a great way to have them. They also make one of the best crusts that I like for if I'm going to dry them. If I'm going to dry them fresh, they can also be very easy to clean if you pick them clean. And they're so firm that you can grate them like a potato. Make one of the best cakes. And when they're dried, the flavor gets concentrated. Lobster mushroom bisque was never a bad idea. But these are the thing that I thought was really interesting was when I was reading about how mushrooms are cooked in the Michoacan Peninsula in Mexico, and they go out there and they call the lobster mushroom the tromba de puerco. So basically, that means the pork horn. And we can learn two different things from the common name here. Tromba, like trumpet, is referring to the shape, and this I want to assume that the species that they're parasitizing there is going to have going to affect the shape that they have, because sometimes I see some with the trumpety type of shape. Sometimes I see this more amorphous, asymmetrical outer space thing. So I don't know. But theirs down there, obviously they're going to have the more of the horn shape. And then trompa de puerco, pork horn, it is a traditional meat substitute. So what they do is, in lieu of meat or something, they take the lobster mushrooms, they boil them, and then they fry them with onions, garlic, jalapeno, and tomatoes, and you eat them with tortillas. That is it. It's like the original mushroom taco. So just a cool little nugget of my favorite lobster mushroom nugget there for you.
Okay, so Richard is asking a question because the lobsters he found were very dirty and difficult to clean. He wondered if you had any tips on cleaning.
Yeah, if they're really dirty, I don't pick them, or I will trim them within an inch of their life. I will carve the orange off.
And then we have another. So Danny says she has a glut of dried black trumpets. What's your recommendation about a recipe for cooking them?
Oh, I would make my trumpet butter. That's probably what I would do.
Thanks.
Chicken of the woods. One thing to know about these is they have an affinity for lemon. So pasta with lemon and chicken of the woods is a great thing to do. My fried chicken of the woods is inspired by my grandma. And actually, there's two recipes on here inspired by my grandma. Both of them are very good. The sesame baked chicken was kind of a newer one that a couple magazines have picked up. And that is my family's favorite chicken recipe that they used to make. One thing to keep in mind with chickens, just that is kind of like a chicken of the woods specific tip, is if you want to add them to soups or to like pasta dishes specifically, if you're going to be cooking them with something that would take away their orange color, there's nothing wrong with just making a dish as you would, and then quick saute some chicken of the woods and just put a chicken on it and just put it on top. And we used to do that to keep so that the guest, when they get the pasta, they see the mushrooms, they see what they ordered. It's not hidden inside there. They're not having fish for it. Just one thing that I will tell people about chicken of the woods.
So
Just serving them, kind of a subconscious thing.
right. So I do have a question about the chicken of the woods, just because we actually have some members who get the sensitivity, like the lip tingling and swelling, and they can't eat chicken of the woods without that. We had Trad Cotter tell us that if you parboil them for about 10 minutes and then get rid of the water, that those are okay to eat. None of those people I know that are sensitive are willing to try it, which I understand. But I'm just curious what your experience has been
Yeah, my experience with both working with plants and mushrooms that may be, because we have a number in both of those places, we have a number of things that are edible, poisonous food. Things that could be both poisonous or edible. And here we're talking about individual sensitivities. So I'm going to go back to when we were talking about boiling. And we have, numerous examples of how wild mushrooms have been boiled around the world. But these people did not contact each other and share their mushroom cooking techniques. Eastern Europe and the Michoacan Peninsula, or all over Mexico, where the Romaria are sold indiscriminately. Though they're boiled, because these people knew they likely learned that boiling makes them safe. So I would say that would not surprise me at all if boiling mushrooms that people have an individual sensitivity to would denature some of that and make them more easily digestible for people that have an individual sensitivity. I know some people with individual sensitivities, and I think it would be very hard to convince them that that would be the truth, though.
So Jeff has a question as well, just about your broader foraging experiences. If you found other forage foods that especially complement certain forage mushrooms, like pairing fiddleheads with chanterelles or whatever combination of greens or other foods that you like to eat with mushrooms or cook with mushrooms.
Yeah, that's seasonal. So if I'm picking a mushroom, let's see. What are the greens that are going to be growing around it? Is there some sow thistle that's growing next to the chanterelles and some lamb's quarter that's here? Maybe I'll have them together just because it was seasonal. That's what was fresh that day. So my favorite thing to cook, people ask me like what my favorite thing to cook is all the time, is whatever is growing right now. So, I may take things that are growing in a place close to each other, but I don't have like specific examples off of the top of my head. Oh, maybe chanterelles, and I'm going to cook them in a stew with beans, and I'm going to add, these were the pine chanterelles I cooked, the Cantarella senalensis. They grow next to blueberries and sweet fern. So maybe I'll take some of the sweet fern, like 2 leaves, and I'll put some in the stew with the chanterelles and beans, as one example. Puffballs. Some people like puffballs. Some people hate them. I love them because I've seen some of the cool things that you can make out of them. Flour will make, if you cut them into slices and then compress them. Compressing puffballs is one of my tricks for them. So I cut them into slices and then I will press them down either with a rolling pin, like underneath a silpat, or some cling film or parchment, and that helps them. It helps them not be so just like a wiggly piece of tofu. Then you dehydrate those and grind them into flour. It'll make your house smell atrocious, so definitely do that outside, and wear a mask when you grind it, because it is not like other mushroom flours at all, and it is quickly airborne and can stick to things, but it is very good. It is very good. You gotta trust me. Puffball lasagna is one of my favorites, and then I will actually, I think the picture got cut off here, but I'll cut them into pieces and roast them, and then I puree them into hummus with tahini, like I would chickpeas, and they make a good dip like that.
Wow, that's amazing.
Chanterelles, I'll just go over these quick. Oh, you got a question?
Yeah, well, there's a few questions and comments, like Ellen is saying your puffball parmesan recipe is better than any chicken parmesan she's ever had.
Oh, thank you.
Then Gary is asking if you ever roast chicken of the woods before using it in dishes to be sure they're cooked. Like, he's feeling that boiling makes them lose some of their flavor. So have you ever tried?
Of course it does. Yeah, boiling anything is not my first choice, except maybe for many different types of greens.
Right. And then Gabe is asking if you have experience with candied mushrooms with any species in particular, because he had made some candied black trumpets. So just wondering.
Yeah, candied black trumpets are good. Yellow feet are also good, and I ate those at my Idol's restaurant in Provence. It was candied yellow feet.
Okay, great.
Okay, chanterelles, like I talked about before, they like to be cooked whole if they are in like a button stage like that. And some of the really big ones, like if I was eating a Cantarellus californicus, I would not be eating that whole. That thing, it would be like a steak. Those I'll probably cut into pieces, and they also are usually very watery when I receive them. Same thing with the what is it? Cantarellus formosus, the one that is probably the most majority of pounds of commercial chanterelles are usually the formosus. Like those are the ones that are sold in Costco. If they're buggy, I love to make soup out of them. I have a recipe for that, and they're just so good in a blend, like on a tartine. I throw all the mushrooms together, but the chanterelles are probably whole. The other mushrooms might be cut into pieces, but if my chanterelles are in that nice button form, I'll still leave them whole to really show off their character. You know, we want to respect the shape, respect the morphology of them as much as I can. Okay, fun experiments to try. Mushroom kimchi. This is kind of an advanced procedure because you need to be familiar with fermentation. And I'm also going to say, there are some people out there that will tell you that like mushroom fermentation is like the greatest thing and it's so good. It is not. Okay, that I ferment mushrooms extremely rarely, and there are very few instances where I will ferment them, with the exception of like that the pheasant back show you that I showed you. And this is not for every mushroom. So each mushroom, every single species, I feel like they are very, very different. And the big difference is how well do they hold their texture. So I would not use chanterelles with this. Even though chanterelles are very firm, they tend to get mushy. This is a good thing to make with those very firm polypores. So this is my favorite one is Ichnoderma. The Ichnoderma resinosum, the resinous polypore, makes a fantastic kimchi because it holds its shape and it does not get slimy or mushy, like soft. I don't want to eat a soft, mushy mushroom. Ugh, no. These hold their shape. Pheasant backs are going to do the same thing. Great way to have them. Shaggy Mane ink is an old school one. I know a number of you probably are familiar with this. But there's an interesting comparison, a similarity that I've seen that is across genera. Because if you look at the Shaggy Manes deliquescing, they're turning to ink. I'm just leaving them out at room temperature, and that should be a bacterial. It's not bacterial decomposition; it's an enzymatic reaction. So very different from something that's like a piece of meat going rotten, right? But one thing that I noticed is that when I turn this into the black puree, I cook it and heat it to sterilize it, and then we'll use it basically like squidding. Wheat lecoche is the same, and also deliquesces into a black inky goo. I thought that was very interesting, and the flavor is similar too. If you know the metallic, what I call the metallic taste of saffron, wheat lecoche and mushroom inks like this, after they've deliquesced, will have that kind of, it's like a twang to it, almost like a not unpleasant taste of aluminum. I know that sounds delicious, but it's good as a squid ink substitute. Risotto, compound butters, you get the idea. And here's a good way to use, if you have mushroom purees or things like that are very dark colored, and maybe you don't want to toss the pasta with it, this is something I do all the time. I take a puree of mushrooms, I put it in the bottom of a bowl, and then I put the pasta that's just dressed very lightly with butter on the top. Very easy. Okay, we have any more Q&A? Otherwise, I was supposed to cook dinner 30 minutes ago.
Oh, okay. We do have one question from Hunter about Clavaria delphis. Have you cooked with that? I think she's
Yes,
asking.
and I did not find them to be sweet, which I think I don't have the variety that's sweet here. I also do not find my variety to be bitter. I want to say the one that I've picked is the Pistillaris, but I'm not certain, but I find them delicious, and if I see them, I pick them whenever I can. But big ones, the ones I pick are kind of large. They're hardwood associates, and I really, really have enjoyed them.
Right. So I would encourage, although I know Alan needs to get going, but if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question and put yourself on video again.
Yeah, go for it. It's fine.
Lots of people saying thank you and what an amazing, outstanding talk this was. So this was wonderful. I learned a lot and appreciate all the tips. So,
Great. Oh, thanks for having me
Claudette.
on.
Yes, I have a question. I don't know if you can see me. I'm holding
I
up a
can.
jar of
Pine cones.
pine cones, and it was kind of confusing. We just did this, my sister and I. We went to the Cape Cod and we found lots of pine cones. So your recipe online was kind of confusing. It wasn't, we weren't quite sure if you were saying equal
Well,
weight.
there's a video too.
What? It's a big.
There's a video too.
Oh, yeah, we watched it. And it still looked to us, it was confusing as to what the actual ratio weight-wise pine cones to sugar was.
Yeah, so equal weight. So if you have a pound of pine cones, it's a pound of sugar.
Okay, because I'm not sure we did that, but we'll see what happens. We're not going to kill ourselves, right, after we boil it up. That's
No, it's resinous and you're heating it. So anything cooked to 212 degrees Fahrenheit is, you're fine. And it's so high in sugar that you could put something in the Mugoglio and it would be preserved. You know, you could use it as a preservative itself. It's extremely safe.
Okay, thank you so much.
For sure.
Cool. All right.
So just as a reminder, Alan, send me your mailing address when
Yeah,
you get
for
a
sure.
chance. Please. Okay,
Great.
Well-
And do you need to actually leave here to go?
he
cook?
does.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you
right.
very
Thanks, everybody.
much.
Thank you, Alan. That was wonderful.
And we will let you know,
Good.
we will let you know when it gets posted on our YouTube channel.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Bye.
And
Thank you. You're back.
Sam, I'm just going to put that link for Dr. Dev Koda in the chat one more time.
And thank you everyone for joining in, and